started a little early because we're changing it up a little bit. So, where's my lighting? There we go. Okay, so make sure that before you watch this presentation that you go onto our story on our Turning Point page and answer the poll over whether you believe that body language is enough to know whether or not you have consent. I'm going to repeat that again. So before you watch this presentation, go to our story and answer the poll over whether or not body language is enough to tell if you have consent. Okay? I'm going to give you a minute to do that. And while we do that, you can get tea, you can go to the bathroom, you can do whatever it is that you need to do before this presentation starts. And we'll just talk. So yeah, I have my tea here. I love a good green tea with lemon. It's so amazing. Good way to start your morning. But we're not here to talk about tea, but we will be watching a tea video later on in this video. So I'm glad that I had to, so that I can exemplify that. But yes, so make sure to go to our poll, answer the poll, and then come back to the stream. I'm going to get set up because once that clock hits 10, then I will begin. Okay. Okay. Hello, my name is Danielle, and I am the Education Specialist here at the Turning Point Rape Crisis Center. This is our presentation called It Takes Unity. It's a bystander's guide on being empowered and educated, because once we're educated about the problem, we can be the change to fix it and support survivors along the way. This is the Turning Point. So we have a 24-hour crisis hotline that is 1-800-886-7273. You can call that number at any time for any of the following things below that we offer. So if you want to call about counseling, if you want to about getting involved with counseling or getting your child or someone you know involved with counseling and what that process looks like, you can call that number. And then advocacy. So if you want to know whether or not you need a SANE exam, which is a sexual assault nurse examination, you can call that number. And education, if you want to book us to present at one of your schools, classes, groups, then call that number and you can also get involved there, or you can go on our website and put in a presentation request. So I kind of broadly touched on each thing we do here at the Turning Point, but now I'm going to go a little bit deeper. So counseling, we offer free counseling for survivors of sexual violence and their friends and family members. We want to make sure that every single person is supported throughout working through this trauma and being able to properly handle supporting the survivors in their life. Next, we offer advocacy. So advocacy is where we go into the hospital and we support the survivor during their SANE exam, which is a sexual assault nurse examination, also commonly referred to as a rape kit. Now, whenever we go into the hospital, we let them know their rights. We hand them any resources that they may need. We get them CVC information, which is Crime Victims Compensation, and we are overall there to support the survivor, answer any questions they have, and just be there to make the experience as calming and as less stressful as possible. And then lastly, we offer education, which is this, where we go into the community and different online platforms and groups and talk about sexual violence, its roots and its causes, because once we're educated about the problem, we can be the change to fix it. So with that, let's get started. Our mission is to highlight the impact of sexual violence on individuals and our community through education programs that foster hope, encourage change, and prevent sexual violence. Join us in the fight against sexual violence. The Turning Point is committed to reducing the prevalence of sexual violence in our community. We firmly believe that for this change to occur, each person has a responsibility and must do their part to prevent sexual violence. So today, we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, consent, and coercion. Three things: sexual harassment, consent, and coercion. We're going to get into what it means and also what it can look like. And we're also going to watch a little bit of videos today. So I hope that you enjoy this presentation. If this is the first one that you've seen, make sure to turn on our post notifications and check out our other presentations after this one. So sexual harassment, what is it? It is any unwelcome verbal, visual, physical, or physical conduct that is sexual in nature. So what are the types? I just said it, but I said it fast. The types of sexual harassment are physical. So this is someone touching your body, putting their hands on your body. Verbal, so talking about your body, talking about what you've done with your body, talking about what they want to do to your body. And visual. Visual is on social media. In this picture, they have a flip phone. We haven't seen a flip phone in a long time, but nowadays they look a little bit more like this, where we have access to all sorts of harassment, because when people are behind a screen, they feel a lot more confident in saying things that they wouldn't say to your face. And so visual is one of our most prominent ones to talk about with sexual harassment, and also all things sexual violence, because anyone can do it from anywhere in the world. So remember, the key components of sexual harassment are that it's sexual in nature, and it makes you feel weird and uncomfortable. A lot of times when we talk about sexual harassment and you list examples, you're like, oh, that I wouldn't care if like my boyfriend did that or something like that. Well, that's the point, is that it's sexual in nature, but it makes you feel weird and uncomfortable. That's the key component, weird and uncomfortable. It's one thing if you want to eat a pizza, but if somebody forced you and held your mouth open to eat pizza, then that's a whole different situation. Usually you love pizza, but now in that circumstance, you don't like pizza, okay? So we have to remember that when we're talking about sexual violence, it's not about whether or not the activity alone is inappropriate. It's more about how it makes you feel when whoever's doing it and whenever they're doing it, if that makes sense. So remember, makes you feel weird and uncomfortable. So now let's get into the examples of sexual harassment. So sexual jokes, comments, or gestures toward or about someone. Now, whenever I said sexual jokes, comments, or gestures, I'm pretty sure that every single one of us could think of a joke or a gesture that somebody said at some point about someone, or even about us. And so if it made you feel uncomfortable, that's sexual harassment. Also, showing someone unwanted sexual images or videos. If somebody sends you an unsolicited nude picture, then that is sexual harassment, because if it makes you feel weird and uncomfortable, it's sexual harassment. And it's about your body parts or anything sexual in nature. So asking for sexual images and videos. Now, you may say, oh, if my partner or somebody that I'm close to asks, or someone I'm comfortable with in that way asks, then it's not harassment. And that's the point, is because if somebody who you aren't comfortable with and something is asking you for something that you aren't comfortable with doing, and they are constantly asking you, even after you've said no, even after you said, hey, that makes me feel uncomfy, that is sexual harassment. Asking someone to go out over and over again, even after the person has said no, is sexual harassment. Spreading rumors about someone's sexual behavior or sexual orientation, what someone did, who someone slept with, all those things are sexual harassment, because imagine how you would feel if they were talking about you. I mean, going to high school, going to middle school, any situation like that, you have people who say ugly things about you. And oftentimes when we're growing up, we hear the words, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And now there's a lot of psychological studies that prove otherwise. The fact of the matter is that words hurt. Any negative comment you make, you have to make 5 positive comments to be able to overpower that one negative comment. So that's why it's so important to watch our words and what we say about people, what we heard about people, and so on and so forth. Unwanted and uncomfortable touching, such as shoulder massages, purposefully brushing up against someone, and etc. Those things that are unwanted and uncomfortable touching, whether they're making it look like it's an accident, or doing something where they can brush along your breast or brush along any sort of private area, that's sexual harassment. If it makes you feel weird and uncomfortable and it's sexual in nature, you let me say this multiple times, it is sexual harassment. You never lose the right to speak up about sexual harassment. If it's in the workplace, if it's in a school setting, the people around you have a liability to do something about it. So use your voice and say something and speak up, because you do not deserve that treatment. You have never deserved that treatment. Nobody deserves that treatment. So now let's switch gears and let's talk about something a little bit lighter. Let's talk about consent. So consent is a clear voluntary agreement for a specific sexual activity during a specific sexual encounter. Okay, so if you give consent on Tuesday, that consent does not roll over till Friday. So it has to be a clear voluntary agreement for a specific sexual activity during a specific sexual encounter. Now, when you talk about consent and how you achieve it, oftentimes people are like, oh my gosh, that's so uncomfortable. That'll just ruin my mood and all of these things. But that's something that the media has told us. And if you look at the media, it hasn't been a great example for proper sexual conduct. In fact, it's perpetuated a lot of negative stereotypes and also a lot of negative sexual messages that led to a lot of hurt and a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. Okay, so in this picture, I would love to just take a moment to pause and allow you to look at this picture and go over the different things that are being said. So here's a moment for that. Okay, I'm giving you enough time to kind of look over it. What I want you to think about is when people say, oh, that sounds awkward and uncomfortable, is it really awkward and uncomfortable to make sure that your partner is okay? A question that I commonly ask young adults whenever I go and speak is, do you want to hurt your partner? And they're like, no. So then when you want to make sure that they're okay so that you don't hurt them, you're like, well, yeah. So it's like, that's what consent is. It's making sure that you and your partner are on the same page. If you're worried about asking for consent with your partner because you're afraid that the activity will stop, then that's something you need to reconcile within yourself on how you feel about power and control, because that is inherently linked with sexual violence. We don't want to commit sexual violence against our partners. So this picture has a lot of great examples of what asking for consent looks like. Saying things like, I think that it's attractive when you do this, or do you like this? Do you like it when are you okay with this? You know, thinking about just checking in with your partner is one of the most respectful things that you can do. You're showing that you care about them. You're showing that you want them to enjoy the experience as much as you do. You want them to be able to be comfortable and open. And when somebody's comfortable and open, then it leads to a much more beautiful experience. So consent is so important, and consent is not awkward. Consent is sexy. So how do you know you have consent? We just went over that. So you just make sure that you have a voluntary agreement. Are you comfortable with this? It's such a simple question, but it gives that person an out. And oftentimes, whenever our brain goes into a state of trauma, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And freeze is actually the most common, especially if somebody has already experienced sexual violence. And with Americans facing sexual assault every 73 seconds, and 1 in 6 women in America will have been the victim of completed or attempted sexual assault in her lifetime, then those numbers are really high. And the prevalence of the fact that you may be interacting with someone who has experienced sexual violence means that you need to make sure that you are making sure that you have consent for that activity. Especially, we are a rape crisis center in Texas, and so our numbers are astronomical. 2 out of every 5 women and 1 out of every 5 men. So 40% of women and 20% of men will have experienced sexual violence, meaning that makes it even more important to make sure that you have consent, that your partner is comfortable. Because out of, if you watch my Myth and Facts series or my Myth and Facts presentation, which go back and listen to it if you haven't already. But if you go back and you listen to it, then you will see that oftentimes survivors are sexually assaulted by someone that they know. And out of that percentage of people that they know, it's usually around the 80 area. A third of that is someone who was a past or present partner, significant other. So it's so important to make sure that you have consent and that you aren't harming your partner or coercing your partner, but we'll get into coercion. So now we're going to watch a little video about consent and what that looks like.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they go, oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you. Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no, thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please, that's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure that they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, exactly. I love that video because it makes it simple to understand consent. Now, consent can sometimes be a complex issue, and some people will say, oh, well, it's not that simple. But if you think about it in the context of tea, it makes it a little bit easier for you to understand what it's like to ask for consent and also understand when, even if you get an answer of yes, that can change and alter as you work through the process of exercising that consent. So let's continue. So coercion. Coercion is things like guilt trips, applying pressure, threats, and feelings of obligation. Coercion is forced consent, okay? So in the video, I talked about getting annoyed or, being upset because you went through all this work to make the tea and yet now they don't want the tea. So coercion is things like, well, if you don't do this, I'm going to tell everybody that you did anyway. So you might as well do it. Or, well, if you don't do this, then I'm not going to give you a ride home. Or if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt you. Now that sounds extreme, but it happens. And feelings of obligation. Well, I did this for you, so now you have to do this for me. Coercion is not consent. If somebody has a gun to your head and says, do you want to have sex? And you say yes, it is not consent because you are being coerced by the situation at hand, which is a gun at your head. Coercion is a verbal, physical, or emotional gun at your head saying that you need to say yes to this or else. coercion is one of the most saddening things about sexual violence, because oftentimes people aren't aware of coercion, and so they're saying, well, I said yes because they were holding a gun at my head, or said that they were going to leave me out in the middle of nowhere or whatever. And that's coercion, and that is still a punishable crime. You do not deserve to be treated like that. I always feel like I have to let people know that what happened to you wasn't okay and it wasn't your fault. So if you're watching this and this touches home, it wasn't your fault. We believe you and we can support you. So let's keep it moving. So legal consent. Texas law says consent for sexual activities cannot be given if someone is asleep, conscious or passed out, mentally or physically incapacitated, under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and under the age of 17. So a lot of times, whenever asleep is the number one thing, I'm like, what? How does that work? Why would anybody think that would be okay? You'd be surprised. There's a huge number. If you go on RAINN.org, you can see statistics for just about every single type of sexual violence. And being asleep is a huge one. The fact that they had to put it in the law that says that you cannot give consent if you're asleep just blows my mind altogether, because you would think that it's common knowledge, but it's not. Also, if you are unconscious or passed out, if somebody is under the influence of drugs or alcohol and they passed out, or they have a medical situation like prescription medicines that make you knock out, things like that, they can't give consent to have sex. And also mentally or physically incapacitated, if they don't know the effects of having sex, like sex equals baby, if you don't have protected sex, or sex can lead to STDs, they are not mentally or physically capable of consenting to sex. And then under the influence of drugs or alcohol, if you are also under the influence of drugs or alcohol, but you are the one that initiated the activity, then you are the one who would face the consequences legally. So that's why it's so important that if there are any drugs or alcohol involved, to just not participate in any sexual activities, because that can really, it's not easy to figure out consent if somebody's under the influence of drugs or alcohol, because they aren't in their right mind state. And so it's a lot easier to hurt somebody in that scenario. And then under the age of 17. 17 is our age of consent in Texas. So if you're under the age of 17, then you cannot give consent. So mandatory reporting laws. I like to touch on this just because not a lot of people know that in the state of Texas, we are all mandatory reporters. So in Texas, laws governing reporting of child abuse and neglect, so these are for under 17, a report of child abuse is not an accusation or a proven fact. It does not require a reporter to be certain of abuse or neglect. In Texas, the degree of certainty which must be met is that a person reporting has cause to believe that abuse or neglect has occurred or will occur. CPS investigates and will determine the nature and extent of the problem, evaluate the child's condition and safety, and if appropriate, initiate action to protect the child. And then law enforcement agency receives the report, and then professionals specifically are mandated to report within 48 hours from discovery or suspicion. Okay? So what kind of things do we see in media that perpetuate this type of violence? So one thing we see is memes, things like this on our social media that make light of perpetrators who enact sexual violence on people. I don't have sex on the first date. Bill Cosby dropping in drugs because he was notorious for drugging women and taking advantage of them. And then it says when she lets you buy her a drink. And it's Bill Cosby again because he was notorious for buying women drinks and drugging them. Then you have Bryson Tiller over here who sexually assaulted a girl who was under the influence of alcohol and was completely incapacitated, and sexually assaulted her and only spent 3 months or less in jail. And there were 2 witnesses who saw it and stopped it, and still served very minimal time. So what do we see in magazines? We see things like this. Let me move my face because I don't know where it is on the screen right now. So what do we see in magazines? We see things like this. We see things like this. We see things like this. Keep this one in your head because I'm going to talk about this one in the next slide. So keep this one in your head, but we see things like this. Things like that. Dolce & Gabbana's response to that picture that I circled around was, Stefano Gabbana says that he regrets the way the ad was perceived and insists that he and his partner were not intending to demean women. He adds that the image was artistic and meant to recall an erotic dream, a sexual game. Now, what do you notice about that apology? Was it an apology? Did you hear an I'm sorry? No. He said that he regrets the way the ad was perceived, not the fact that he created the ad, not the fact of what the ad signified and what the message was. An erotic dream and a sexual game of this, that's not a sexual game. That's a reality for tons of men and women in America, marginalized communities, people who are in states of oppression, have higher rates of sexual violence. We see sexual violence so often. It is not an artistic sexual game. It is reality, and it's disgusting that we put these types of things in our media. So I want to highlight a magazine that used their voice for good and used their voice to speak on such an uncomfortable topic. So we're going to show this video now. So let's see.
My name is Charlie Coleman, and my sister was sexually assaulted by a group of guys that I thought were my friends and left to die in my yard in sub-freezing weather. They were my teammates. I ate with them at lunch. I had classes with them 3 or 4 hours a day. They were close enough to me that they could have called me and I would have came and got her at 2 in the morning or whatever time. But instead, the guys, they sat there, they kind of egged it on. They took picture and video and they let it happen. The idea of masculinity, people think that you have to dominate everything. You really have to dominate in the workforce. You have to dominate in the weight room, the ball field. And you don't want to hear no. People that don't take no for an answer, people that succeed in life, you strive for the best all the time. You got to prove your masculinity. We see comments being made about women saying, oh, it's just locker room talk. Boys will be boys. That's accepting the culture as it is and allowing it to grow. I don't think being a bystander that doesn't do anything is okay. People think that's the right thing to do because when we were growing up, everybody had heard, mind your own business. We're not taught to step in and defend somebody who can't defend themselves. Even there's situations where girls more open to their sexual life or something like that. Some people don't think twice about it because they're like, oh, well, she normally goes and sleeps around. When you categorize them, it doesn't mean that they want that just based on what they're wearing or what they've done with other people in the past. It doesn't matter who they are. They're a person. Everybody says no means no, but it goes a lot deeper than that and people don't realize it. If someone's quiet or doesn't flat out say yes or engage themselves in it, you can't say that they're consenting because you can take the girl back to your room or go back to her room with her. And if she wakes up the next day and that's not something she remembers or remembers consenting to or wanted, then you are very much part of the problem. If there's one thing in this world I think that young men need to learn to carry on through their lives is respect for another. Start by talking about, you have to respect this person. It's not about what she's wearing. The kid comes home at 13 years old and talking with his friends about, oh my God, did you see her butt today in social studies? Or the volleyball team would go on their daily run past the field and they'd be like, oh my gosh, those spandex kind of thing. It's people talk like that. It's actually more disgusting than we see it as. And it happens all too often because we haven't been taught. It is up to the parents, the role models, the older brothers, the older sisters to start putting these ideas in kids' heads that this is not a thing that's okay.
That is a heavy video. And the thing that makes it even heavier is his sister and another survivor have a documentary on Netflix called Audrey and Daisy. It's a really amazing documentary. And both of them actually committed suicide after facing sexual violence. His sister fought against her depression and PTSD for a really, really long time. and lost that battle last week, actually. And that's why it's so, so, so important to talk about these things, because if we don't use our voice to speak out against sexual violence, then we perpetuate the problem. What we permit, we promote. And I don't promote that. I promote using your voice for change and using your voice to be able to create a world where we don't have to worry about this problem anymore. So let me go ahead and close us out. So these are the types of things that happen to people who commit sexual violence. So there are no consequences for people who commit sexual violence. Florida State University paid almost $1 million to cover up sexual violence reports. Brock Turner, he got out of jail after his sexual assault sentence with 2 people who witnessed what happened. He was released 3 months early. The survivor always does more time than the perpetrator of the crime. And that's something that I wish would change, because instead of supporting survivors, oftentimes in society, we support the accused. We say, well, let's hear his side of the story. When somebody gets their car stolen or their house broken into, we don't ask the burglar what their side of the story is. We say, they committed a crime, and now let's charge them and go through the criminal justice system, etc. But our first question to survivors is usually, what did you do? What were you wearing? Why were you there? Why were you drinking? No matter what you did, you never deserve for that to happen to you. And I am deeply sorry for anyone who ever made you feel like you were responsible. You are never responsible for someone taking advantage of you. So, what are some ways that you can make a change? You can make a change by being educated and spreading your education to people who don't know about these things and don't know the statistics and don't know the pain and the suffering that so many people face every single day. They hold with shame or with pain and hide within themselves. We need to create a world where we can support survivors and they can come out and we can just instantly believe them and we can instantly support them and let the criminal justice system do what they're supposed to do. If somebody makes a false outcry, you're not a detective, okay? Let the detective do that work, okay? Now, your duty is to support survivors and to educate others and to just use your voice for good and to create a world where we can all feel safe. Any questions? If you ever have any questions after a presentation, you can always call that crisis hotline for any questions revolving around sexual violence. I'm so glad that you joined us today. Make sure that if you haven't answered that poll, do not answer the poll if you've gotten to this part of the video. I will post the poll tomorrow morning with the same question, and I want you to answer the poll again with this new knowledge that you've gained from this presentation. So if you have gotten to the end of this video, then answer the poll that I will post tomorrow, the same question with your new knowledge, and see if you have a different answer. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I will see you next week for our next presentation, education presentation at next Thursday at 10 a.m. I'll see you then. Bye.